Welcome to the Futures Forum Live online, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. On this edition of the Futures Forum Live, we exchange ideas, information, education, and inspiration about the future of Black America. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Get Futures Sense now. Share this story and share our future. Stay tuned for a journey to the future with host Dr. Claire Nelson.
Greetings and welcome to Futures Forum Live, an online e-magazine of the Futures Forum. So we're having another conversation on the future history of Black America because why? It's February, Black History Month. I want to examine exactly why and how Blacks in America might face 2030 and beyond. Now, 2030 is considered a pull year for many countries in the world who have signed on to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These are 17 global goals for achieving greater sustainability, and Goal 10 says more or less inequality. Now, by 2030, it is also said America will become a majority-minority country and will no longer be the world superpower. Now, what might this mean for Blacks and minorities in America? How might the economic, social, and technological shifts emerging impact our well-being in the Black community? So today, I'll be speaking with Dr. Jeffrey Ann Wilder. Right. Dr. Jeffrey Wilder is a sociologist and leading scholar specializing in diversity, race relations, and women's empowerment. She works as a research faculty member at the University of Colorado Boulder in the National Center for Women in Technology. She works to create research-driven resources that will equip and empower its members with tools to increase women and girls' participation in computing and technology. She holds a doctorate in sociology from the University of Florida. Furthermore, prior to joining this center, she was founding director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnic Relations at the University of North Florida. So without further ado, let us jump right into a conversation with Dr. Wilder. How are you?
I'm great, Dr. Nelson. How are you today?
I'm really pleased you could join me, so I'm happy.
Wonderful.
So I reached out to you because I was just fascinated by this idea of a center that's focused around women in technology, and your work is focused around promoting women of color and empowering women of color in this space. Now, as you heard me say, 2030 is a pull year, and when you look at 2030, you're talking about 8 billion people, right? AI will be ubiquitous everywhere, the Internet of Things, Industry 4.0. We're talking about automation. So people are presuming that formal unemployment will be high. Unions are going to have their back against the wall. With this in mind, I think achieving the goals might be a feat of dream engineering. But as I think about it, I wanted to find out, when we're talking about inequality in this future, what do you think the future history of Black America might look like? From your vantage point, when you think of 2030, what do you think it might look like?
Well, I hate to sound so cliche, but from my vantage point, I think the future of Black America in 2030, unless some things really shift, it's really going to resemble the past and the present of Black America right now. Only because I think one of the really interesting things about the 21st century thus far has been this notion of revisiting issues, right? So the resurgence of, or the sort of the genesis of the Black Lives Matter movement, right, rests upon the death of Trayvon Martin. And we know that Trayvon Martin died, I think it was back in 2013, so 6 years ago at this point.
Wow.
And the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who murdered Trayvon Martin, really birthed the Black Lives Matter movement. And although Trayvon Martin isn't necessarily the face of the movement per se, we know that there are countless others, unfortunately, from Trayvon Martin to Sandra Bland, what we've been faced with, I think, particularly in this decade, has been this notion. So, and forgive me if I kind of speak to a number of different things. I always make it full circle.
No.
One of the things I think we've been faced with since the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly for millennials, is facing issues that a lot of people thought were no longer issues, right? This idea of us being post-racial. Race doesn't matter anymore. Why are these things happening? Because race doesn't matter anymore. We are seeing the death of young Black people. We're seeing the resurgence of inequality. We're seeing police violence. We're seeing the violence of women of color. We're seeing senseless death in very similar ways that people saw in the 1950s and 1960s, right?
So let me just stop right there. But might we not assume that we're seeing this because, in fact, there is, let's say, a fear, the fear of, let's say, a Black, quote unquote, power being real is what is driving this existential fear and pushback because we had a Black president?
I would argue that, but I think that fear does not live internally within the Black community. I think that fear is something that exists externally. And, you know, of course, right, all of this happens alongside, and there's so much literature around this now. All this has happened alongside the two-term presidency of the America's first Black president, right? So it's a really interesting juxtaposition that we're seeing, or we saw the resurgence of so many racial issues at the very time when racial issues weren't supposed to matter anymore, right? So when you have the election and the two-term presidency of a Black president, you sort of see the height of all these really horrible inequities related to the Black community happening, right? So of course, you know, it's a chicken or egg question, which one, you know, which happened first. A lot of folks would argue that we saw that because of, right, in response to, you know, a two-term, the first Black president, of course, over the course of 8 years. And I don't know if I've answered your question yet, right?
Well, yeah, well, yes and no, because you told me, number one, you're not very, at this point, very optimistic. Well, we'll see if we can get you there, right?
Yeah.
But you also spoke to why that is, and you're talking basically about this increase, let's say, in racial tensions, which we thought was dead. So let's take it right there. So let's look at where technology is taking us, because in fact, the Black president was able to win in part because he used technology to get there. So now we have a technology-driven movement. The Black Lives Matter movement, for example, is a hashtag. We know that.
Right.
But when we're thinking about 2030, and we're thinking about also now the pushback, we've seen, for example, in this recent Congress, a much larger number of Black people running for office. So in this future then that we're talking about creating, given what is happening, do you see political agency continuing to be critical to achieving a more, let's say, sustained, basic moral fairness in our society?
Yes and no. So on the one hand, right, in response to another election, which took place in 2016, we're seeing unprecedented numbers of women and people of color running for office and being elected to office. And we saw this, in fact, during the preterm elections in 2018. The fact remains, or at least for me, I'm not as optimistic about it just yet, because even though you have an increase of political participation and voter engagement, that does not necessarily mean that levels of optimism are big enough to sustain, right, that continued engagement and participation over time. And if you're thinking about 2030, the fact remains, at least for me as a social scientist, I don't think the question has been answered. So I don't know if there's been enough attention to Black issues, so to speak, and a consensus around what are the big issues for the Black community. There hasn't been enough of a consensus on that just yet. Because, by the way, identity politics has always been at the center of the Black American narrative, right? So, for instance, during the civil rights movement, are we fighting for racism or are we fighting for sexism, right? So we heard later from Black women that even though the fight for racism was really, really important, that we know that fight must be intersectional because we're still dealing with a lot of sexism and homophobia within the Black community, even though we've got the fight for racism, at the forefront. So I don't know yet.
So you said that there are like some big issues. So if you could you name in your head what are the top 3, let's say, big issues around which we let's say disadvantaged that we want to kind of flesh out a little bit in the next few minutes we have?
The first one I would think is economic disenfranchisement, right? So we have large numbers of Black Americans who are attaining educational degrees. So you've got more Black women, we keep hearing all these stats about more Black women completing degrees at much, much higher rates than everybody else, right? We know that the participation and the attendance and graduation rates of Black Americans is the highest it's ever been. However, in spite of Black Americans being incredibly credentialed, particularly us Black women, right? There is still a huge wealth gap. Right. So, and actually we've lost ground. We haven't gained ground over the past 10 years. We've lost ground as far as building wealth for the future. And even, economic wealth in the sense of income versus wealth, there's still a gap there. So I would say economic disenfranchisement for me would be the number one. Or one of the big issues, right? I don't know if there are 3 big issues or 4 big issues or what have you.
Well, I like that one because I love economic development. So I'm going to dive right in on that. So let's look at economic development and your work and your passion around engendering more women in the technology space. Because part of, I guess, my concern is the notion that technology, the new gospel according to technological advancement, actually may be a gospel of further disparity for people who are already disadvantaged. How are you beginning to think through then the sorts of policies that might need to be put in place so that that economic gap might be reduced because people, for example, have access to jobs or access to finance to create those jobs?
Right. So when you think about technology, I think people only really digest one kind of thing, right? So you can be an avid user of technology, and we already know the numbers of Black Americans and Hispanic Americans as well. We are very avid users of technology, right? There are lots of us who have smartphones, and a large majority of us access our news and our information through our phones rather than a laptop or an iPad, right? However, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are significant numbers of Black Americans and other communities of color who are tapping into that technology workforce. And that's where the disparity lies, right? Everyone has a smartphone, right? Everyone's on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and we know that Black people respond very well. So social media platforms, let's say Black Twitter, for instance, is the new, it's the civil rights movement 2.0, right? So Black Lives Matter was born on Twitter, right? Hashtag, right? So we know that Black people take to social media to digest, process, rebut, push up against, and challenge a lot of our issues. However, look at the number of Black people who know how to code, who are interested in coding, who knows what coding is. If you look at the K-12 level, the number of students of color who are enrolling in, who are encouraged to enroll in, because it's not their problem, it's not their fault per se, who are encouraged to take computer science courses. At the college level, those folks who are encouraged to major in some aspect of computer science, there's such a huge gap there. So even though people are consumers of technology, that does not necessarily mean that they are sitting at the driver's seat, the forefront of technology from a workforce perspective. We already know that the jobs in computing are going to outpace every other kind of job by 2030, right? We know that. But there still is a huge knowledge gap when it comes to participation of Black Americans in those kinds of jobs, right? So technology, in my mind, means different kinds of things. Are you a user of technology?
Mhm.
Or is technology really driving and becoming an equalizer, if you will, of economic disenfranchisement?
Well, that's the question I probably want to ask. How then do you see? So let's look at a space that, quote unquote, we may be able to control, for argument's sake.
Sure.
This was just a thought experiment of, let's say, a Black town in a state that's a majority Black state. Let's call it maybe Mississippi. I don't know. I'm making this up. I don't know, right?
It is a majority Black state.
Okay, so right. So
Yes.
it's there in your, could there be like a conjecture, that there could be a thought experiment around taking, say, 3 towns or 3 small cities which are under 100,000 people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And running a sort of a longitudinal experiment between 2020 and 2030, using some of these goals that I've been talking about in terms of how we deal with inequality by having an intensive, if you will, 360-degree embedding of these constructs around how the world will change and how, therefore, both the government, which is largely Black in this case, right, how the financial community, which even if it's a white one inside this town, but you have enough like Black wealth outside then that could invest in that community, how the Black school system could basically begin to create a culture not only for the students in their school, but the parents of those students. Do you see that this kind of a, I guess, thought experiment could be a real experiment and therefore be a way to kind of begin to address some of these concerns that I certainly have, and probably you have them as well, you work in this space every day, about technology not being a further dividing tool, but one that can actually help make more boats rise, as you would say?
Absolutely. And I think those conversations are already happening in the tech world. So people are already looking toward areas or pockets of communities that are disproportionately, in a good way, or excuse me, predominantly minority, and looking at how to level the playing field, how to make those spaces more equitable when it comes to knowledge about technology or having access to certain understandings of certain jobs or things related to the computing workforce. So I think those conversations are happening already. But the other piece of that for me that is very, very stark is a recognition, or posing the question of a recognition of funding. So it has to, I talk about this idea of interest convergence all the time, right? So there needs to be a convergence of agreement, right? Or consensus that this is really important for all of us,
Yes.
right? So leveling the playing field in tech, decreasing the economic disenfranchisement of minority communities needs to be just as important to you and I as it is to the CEO of some nonprofit or the CEO of some corporation or some billionaire, right? So at what point are we going to get to interest convergence, or getting everyone to agree that it is important to put money and funding in places that are really going to level the playing field? And I think that becomes the issue, because I think we're always in a position of deficit, having to make the case. So in other words, we shouldn't have to make the case. It should be, people should hear the numbers and see how low they are and say, we've got to do something about this. But I think right now, which is again, sort of back to your first question, sort of revisiting the past, we're not at a space yet, we're not at a point yet, I think, as a society where, gosh, Black Lives Matter, dare I say, right? Recognizing how important it is to ensure the economic vitality of the Black community en masse. And we know that the Black communities are different by ethnic background and nationality and class and color and all those things. But how do we get beyond making a case for it to get to entrance convergence? Like, we all know that, well, I guess we don't all know, but we all know that it's important for everyone to be healthy, right?
Yes.
healthcare is really, like, you don't really need to make a case for us all having access to healthcare, right? Some would disagree with that. How do we get to a point where, right? Well, I think everyone agrees that access to healthcare is important. I think the question becomes who's paying for it? Who's paying for that access? I think the question becomes, how do we make the case to people who are not Black? To people who really, it doesn't impact them directly or indirectly. That to me is the heart of the issue.
Well, I think that is why this conversation I'm trying to raise up and to make more visible the future history of Black America is one that I have some passion around and some concern around, because if indeed we're living in a time when we can not only choose our gender, so it's a very different human period in history, right?
Yes, yes.
But just a couple weeks ago, it was announced that they have now identified the gene that creates color. And so the first thing I said was, I wonder how many people are going to now choose to change their color, right?
I'm not choosing, right? I like the
we
color.
know that the sale of bleaching cream, certainly in Africa and the Caribbean and India and Asia, is very large. That's another whole conversation we can't go into today.
Yes.
But if inequality, which is what we're trying to, if inequality as, let's say, a construct that is measurable, right, is based on a system that has been developed over the last 500, 600 years of personal bias, which was constructed because of an economic system.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
How do we, as concerned Black people, then begin to figure out the unraveling of that thread?
That's a great question and a great point. And I will also sort of point out, so I have been studying colorism for over 20 years. It was a topic of my dissertation topic, looking at colorism among Black women. I wrote a book about it in 2015 and continue to publish on the issue of colorism. Interestingly enough, a lot of social scientists argue that if you're thinking about the future of race, not necessarily racism, but race and racial identity, racism, people start saying 20 years ago that race is no longer going to be important, right? That skin color was going to be the dividing thing in the future. So in other words, it didn't really matter, won't really matter, right? Because there's so many more people who are multiracial. We know that Hispanics can be any race, right? People are saying that once we hit that majority minority point, it will be less salient about whether or not you're Hispanic or Black, or if you're African American or you're Jamaican, or if you're from Ghana. What people will start to place more emphasis on will be how light you are, how dark you are, right? And we already know the research shows us that economics, right? Educational attainment, SES, not only is that structured along racial lines, it's also structured along color lines as well.
And that's everywhere in the world.
Yes.
So that's another whole story for global inequality. Certainly in Latin America, where I was very involved, the economic development movement for Blacks in Latin America is very much a champion of that movement. Around the time of the UN World Conference on Racism, very aware of that issue of the color line and the brown paperback test.
Well, one more point on that before we move on. So Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who is a sociologist, wrote back in 2004 that by 2020, 2030, the United States he wrote about the literal Latin Americanization of the United States, because racial categories in the US are so different. How we talk about classify race is very, very different. He and others argue that the United States will more be reflective of a lot of Latin American, Caribbean countries, a lot of African countries, a lot of Asian countries that have these layers of class and color. So, but you already know that.
I should laugh. I have to laugh. You can't take these things too seriously, or we surely will be unhappy. So as we roll up to a close, so we're talking then about as somebody working in the space of trying to get women in technology and women of color into technology, what keeps you up at night in terms of trying to identify, not just, okay, here are the toolkits you can use to actually teach it, but
Yeah.
now to actually get the toolkits funded and implemented, for example?
Mhm. I think the most important thing, at least a lot of the conversations that are being had in that particular space, is really about knowledge exchange and education, and the really most basic of senses. So thinking about how we broaden participation really comes down to educating people about the kinds of careers you can have in tech, demystifying the barriers and the stereotypes that girls aren't good in science, right? You already know that. You're an engineer. I'm sure you've had lots of stories about having to demystify those misconceptions, right? Starting very, very early. I have a first grader, and I've already talked to her at length already about computing, and introducing her to Mae Jemison, and look at Mae Jemison, look at what she did, right? And if you want to, you don't have to limit yourself as far as what you want to do and be once you grow up, right? It has to start really, really early. So on the most basic of levels, it's about encouragement and education, right? If you get more people interested, more girls and women interested in these things, recognizing it's actually something that they can do, then that's how you start to move the needle.
So when you think about your first grader in 2030, 2035, then, what's the future of the American dream that you have for her?
Gosh, she graduates from high school in 2030, right? That's a very scary thought. She will graduate from high school at that point. And I honestly teach her already that there are no bounds. So it's a really interesting juxtaposition, because the scholar in me, right, wants to recognize history and know that, oh gosh, it's, you hesitate being optimistic because you already know, like, what the science tells you, what history tells us. But then also as a parent, right, which throw all the books out the door, right, all the research out the door, right, when you're actually coming to living it and being a parent, I think about no limits, right? I
Yes.
don't want her to have those limits on her. So hopefully I'm wrong, 11 years from now when it's 2030 and she's graduated from high school, it's her senior year. Hopefully I've been proven wrong.
Well, actually, that's exactly the point. If we're talking about a future and recognizing that the future that emerges is a combination of the output and the outcomes and the outpourings of the visions of what we're doing now, right? Then clearly we can impact that future. So the question is, for me, what is the future of the American dream from a Black perspective? And that's what I'm trying to get to. So as we wrap up, we're talking about a planetary civilization. We're talking about, economic development for the Black community in a time when we're talking about China probably surpassing America. How do you think being a woman, a Black woman in the space that you're in, can, together with other women in the spaces that you also influence, make a difference in the design of these governance institutions and systems?
Well, so this is the cool part, right? Because immediately I thought about, people say the future is female. I would argue the future is Black female, because we're already starting to see, am I right? Am I right? That's correct, right? When you start to think about even the stat I brought up earlier about more Black women going to college and earning degrees and all this stuff. If you think about, and it's not always about educational attainment, I recognize that, right? So not everyone has to get a degree. But if you think about the conversations we've had as a society over the past couple of years about women, the conversations and the sort of courageous things that women have started to do. They've been doing it forever. And also the really interesting narrative of Black women, right? For instance, Black women, startups, right? The really great conversations about the numbers of Black women who are, crashing the tech ceiling. I think that the future looks also very, very bright when you think about the capabilities and the sort of inherent pride that comes, that's a part of being a Black woman and a Black girl, right?
Mhm.
This idea of Black girl magic is not a myth, right? It's true. And so I think if we rest on that and sort of coupled with this notion of, a no limit sort of mentality, that our future looks really, really bright. So I know that may contradict some of the things I was saying earlier.
So, and then if I was to ask you this question and answer it in one word, are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic about the future?
I'm going to go with optimistic.
Yeah. So with that in mind, I want to picture June 2030 or 2032, because she's probably in grade 11, 12 by 2032, right?
She's graduating in 2030.
Fantastic.
Yes.
So 2030 is graduation day. What is a headline about Black America that you would like to see? An aspirational, positive headline, and it is now on you clicked on your whatever to call it, whatever it would be called in those days, right?
It'll be a chip on my hand, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
What would it say?
Greatest gains in the decade, right? So I think that when you look toward this decade, the 2020 and forward, that decade, the decade that we're sort of, staring right into, the headline should be greatest gains. And I would even argue greatest gains made by Black women, not at the detriment of anyone else. So it's actually kind of cool that she is graduating in 2030, because it makes me a lot more hopeful about her future and our future.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this insightful conversation, because that's a very positive note to end. And I like to always end on an optimistic note on what the future history of Black America could be as it continues to emerge. And I want to just say, for you in listener land, thank you for joining us on the Futures Forum Live, where we explore salient ideas for sustainable futures. Remember, the future is embedded in the landscape of today. So seize the future. We create the future today. And as we take another exciting journey to the landscape of the future, I say until next time.
You have been listening to the Futures Forum Live online.
Thank you.
This podcast aims to tell and share stories about the emerging future and help us better shape the future we want. The Futures Forum Live online is a production of the Futures Forum in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Get future sense now. Remember, our future is embedded in the landscape of the present. Share this story and share the future.